In the 1500s, power in England belonged exclusively to men. Kings made the laws, led the armies, and dictated the future. Society expected women, even royal women, to remain quiet, marry strategically, and above all, produce sons. King Henry VIII structured his entire reign around a singular, obsessive goal: securing a male successor. He viewed a son as the only valid continuation of his legacy. When his second wife, Anne Boleyn, gave birth to a daughter instead of a boy, Henry was deeply disappointed. That disappointment turned fatal. 2 years later, the king had Anne arrested on dubious charges and beheaded with a sword. That 2-year-old daughter was Elizabeth. She was born into a ruthless political machine where her gender offered zero protection, and her very existence could mark her for death at any moment. Following her mother's execution, the king legally declared Elizabeth illegitimate. He stripped away her royal titles and erased her entirely from the line of succession. Years later, the crown passed to her older sister Mary. Mary was a strict Catholic, and she viewed the Protestant Elizabeth as an immediate existential threat to her fragile rule. In 1554, Mary locked her 20-year-old sister inside the Tower of London. Elizabeth was now waiting inside the exact same prison where her mother was killed, unsure if she would ever leave alive. She had zero leverage to negotiate her release. She commanded no army, possessed almost no wealth, and lacked any political allies brave enough to rescue her. Sitting on the cold stone steps of her prison, Elizabeth realized that her survival depended on absolute restraint. In a court where one wrong word or a single intercepted letter meant the executioner's block, she adopted a strategy of total watchful caution that would define the rest of her life. 4 years later, Queen Mary died without an heir. By the laws of England, the crown unexpectedly passed to a 25-year-old Elizabeth. Almost instantly, Parliament and foreign leaders began demanding that she choose a husband. The prevailing belief was that a country required a king to actually govern, reducing the queen to the role of a mother to future kings. Firmly, Elizabeth refused to surrender her hard-won autonomy. Instead of choosing a suitor, she stood before Parliament and declared that she was already married to the Kingdom of England. This map illustrates how she weaponized her single status. Elizabeth deliberately entertained ongoing marriage proposals from the princes of Spain, France, and Austria. She danced with them and wrote them encouraging letters, keeping their hopes alive without ever saying yes. As long as these foreign powers believed they might win control of England through marriage, they held off on attacking. She used this diplomatic gridlock to buy her country precious years to rebuild its finances and strengthen its military. She crafted an intricate mythic public persona, leaning into the title of the Virgin Queen. She replaced the societal expectation of motherhood with an image of a pristine, untouchable ruler fiercely devoted to her people. By rejecting a husband, Elizabeth maintained absolute control over her own life. She turned the expectation of marriage into a tactical shield that kept the most aggressive nations in Europe completely paralyzed.
Eventually, King Philip II of Spain grew tired of the endless diplomacy. Angered by Elizabeth's independence and her support for Protestant rebels, he decided to take England by force. Look at this chart comparing the scale of his invasion force. In 1588, Philip launched the Spanish Armada, a massive fleet consisting of 130 warships and carrying roughly 30,000 men. Compare that to the tiny bar representing the English defense force. Across Europe, observers looked at these numbers and assumed Elizabeth's smaller navy would be immediately crushed. Instead of hiding, Elizabeth put on armor and rode a white horse out to meet her badly outnumbered soldiers at Tilbury. She told them she had the body of a weak and feeble woman, but the heart and stomach of a king. In the dead of night, the English secretly launched 8 burning ships directly into the crowded Spanish fleet. The Spanish panicked, broke their defensive formation, and scattered. The faster English ships then picked apart the chaotic armada before a massive storm moved in and destroyed much of what remained. Defeating the world's largest empire shattered the deeply held belief that a woman could not command a military. Against all odds, Elizabeth secured England's borders and its sovereign future. Surviving the Armada unleashed a massive wave of national confidence. English ships began sailing to every corner of the globe,
launching expeditions that would eventually establish trade routes and colonies far beyond their small island. Back at home, a cultural explosion was taking shape in the form of the public theater. Structures like the Globe were built in London, creating large, dedicated spaces where thousands of people from all classes gathered for entertainment. Playwrights like William Shakespeare arrived in the city and began producing works like Romeo and Juliet and Hamlet. Through their plays, the English language rapidly expanded, taking on new vocabulary and narrative power. Elizabeth actively supported these artists, regularly attending plays and funding the arts to foster a shared, unifying national culture. Under her strategic guidance, England transitioned from a financially ruined, religiously divided nation into a wealthy, culturally dominant global power. But a 45-year reign exacted a heavy personal toll. As Elizabeth grew older, she outlived her most trusted advisors, her closest friends, and the generation that had helped her build the state. When she died in 1603 at the age of 69, she left no children behind. Because of her deliberate choice never to marry, the Tudor dynasty ended with her final breath. Her final days were quiet and solitary, spent listening to the same music she loved as a young woman. Yet outside her palace walls, the English empire she had carefully constructed was loud, thriving, and stronger than ever. The girl they called illegitimate, the prisoner who once sat on the cold steps of the tower, proved that a queen could rule entirely on her own terms. By choosing her country over everything else, she left behind a nation that was finally secure, creative, and confident in its own identity. Imagine walking into a library in Paris today, asking to see a specific set of private notebooks, and being handed a strict liability waiver. You have to sign it before a librarian will even bring the documents out to you in a heavy, lead-lined box. That extreme security protocol exists because those pages, born Maria Skłodowska in 1867, she grew up in a Warsaw controlled by the schools, and the gates of the local university were locked to women. She refused to accept that barrier. She and her friends formed a secret network called the Floating University, constantly shifting their classes from kitchens to quiet back rooms to evade the Russian police. To get a formal education, she made a grueling pact with her older sister, Brana. Maria worked as a governess in distant households for 5 years, sending nearly everything she earned to Paris to pay for Brana's medical degree. She survived on the bare minimum, teaching herself advanced physics at night in her bedroom. By 1891, it was her turn. She boarded a train to Paris, changed her name to Marie, and enrolled at the Sorbonne. She lived in a tiny, unheated room where the water in her wash basin froze overnight. She ate little more than bread and chocolate, yet she graduated first in her entire physics class. Walking across that graduation stage was the end of a 10-year journey through illegal schools and manual labor. Finishing at the top of a class that once barred her entry was the final evidence that she had outlasted every barrier Warsaw or Paris could put in her path. In Paris, she met Marie Curie, a gentle and brilliant physicist. When they married in 1895, Marie skipped the traditional white gown. She chose a practical, dark blue dress, one she could wear straight into the laboratory without worrying about dirt and chemical stains. And the laboratory they shared was punishing. It was a damp, freezing shed with a low, leaky roof and poor ventilation. By any objective measure, it was entirely unsuited for precision science. Looking at this laboratory equipment, you can see the simple glass tubes and flasks they used to investigate a strange new observation by scientist Henri Becquerel. He had noticed that certain natural materials gave off invisible rays, energy that passed right through solid objects without any obvious heat or light source to trigger it. Marie studied these materials deeply, and she realized something profound. The invisible energy wasn't coming from two different elements reacting with each other. It was originating from inside the atom itself. It was an inherent property of the material's structure. She needed a new word to describe a physical element that was constantly active, constantly producing rays of energy. She called it radioactivity. This discovery challenged the era's understanding of matter. Previously, scientists thought atoms were solid, inert blocks. Marie proved they were dynamic, active sources of hidden energy. To prove her theory, Marie and Pierre had to isolate the exact elements causing this radiation. For years, they manually hauled, stirred, and boiled down several tons of a heavy dirt called pitchblende. They filtered the thick, toxic sludge by hand in the freezing cold of their shed. This chart of elements eventually had to be updated to include the result of their labor. They discovered two entirely new elements. The first she named polonium, a defiant nod to her erased Polish homeland. The second, which emitted a faint, beautiful blue light in the dark of their lab, they named radium. This physical and mental endurance earned Marie the 1903 Nobel Prize in Physics, which she shared with Pierre and Becquerel. She became the first woman in history to win the award. Her genius extended far beyond the chalkboard. She literally extracted a new, glowing piece of reality out of tons of raw earth through sheer patience. Then, in 1906, a devastating tragedy struck. While crossing a crowded, rainy Paris street, Pierre was knocked down by a fast-moving, horse-drawn carriage. He was killed instantly. Left entirely alone, Marie funneled her intense grief directly back into the laboratory. When the University of Paris offered her Pierre's vacant teaching position, she accepted. On her first day, a massive crowd gathered to watch her become the first female full professor at the Sorbonne. She stepped into the lecture hall, opened her notes, and began speaking from the exact sentence where Pierre had left off. Working now in deep isolation, she pushed her research further. She successfully isolated pure radium, an achievement so monumental it earned her a second Nobel Prize in 1911, this time in chemistry. She stood at the peak of global science, yet the very elements she had spent her life championing were quietly destroying her from the inside out. When the First World War broke out, Marie immediately saw a practical application for her work. She designed mobile X-ray units, vehicles fitted with radiological equipment to photograph the inside of the body. This allowed field doctors to quickly locate shrapnel and broken bones in wounded soldiers. She didn't just design them, she personally drove these petite Curies out to the field hospitals near the front lines. She trained nurses to operate the complex equipment, ultimately helping treat an estimated 1 million soldiers during the conflict. She easily could have stayed safe in an academic tower, protecting her fragile health. Instead, she took a highly volatile, dangerous force and engineered it into a practical tool for mass salvation. But decades of handling radioactive materials with bare hands finally took their toll. In 1934, at the age of 66, Marie died of aplastic anemia. Her bone marrow had been completely destroyed by the continuous, unprotected radiation exposure. Today, her body remains highly radioactive, buried in a lead-lined coffin, and those notebooks sitting in the Paris library still carry the measurable, hazardous signature of the energy she spent her life uncovering. Marie Curie's legacy proves that true scientific discovery requires stepping willingly into the dark, enduring years of grueling invisible work, and bringing out the light, no matter the cost to oneself.
A swipe of face powder or a shrieking skull whistle was once a matter of life, death, and divine order. Without mass media to broadcast their authority, ancient elites projected power through their physical presence. They utilized their own bodies, the soldiers at their gates, and sounds echoing through their temples to command the room. Aesthetics, warfare, and art served as highly engineered theaters of power, calculated performances designed to make an abstract authority feel tangible. Every pluck of an eyebrow, every synchronized march, and every ritual melody strictly enforced social hierarchies and terrified anyone who might oppose the status quo. This illuminated manuscript illustrates the physical isolation associated with medieval high status. Tanned skin signaled manual labor, while translucent paleness proved a person never saw the sun. Nobility achieved this look by applying lead-based white powder, providing a porcelain finish while slowly poisoning the wearer. Women also manipulated the architecture of the face. They painfully plucked away their eyebrows and used depilatory creams to push their hairlines back, creating massive, unblemished foreheads, signaling refinement. This created a moral paradox. A flawless appearance implied divine blessing and a pure soul, yet the intense effort required to look perfect sat dangerously close to the sin of vanity. Ultimately, the medieval face functioned as a curated performance, proving a person's total economic disengagement from the world of work.
The Achaemenid kings projected power through the Persian immortals, a mobile political message wrapped in silk and steel. This elite force utilized psychological warfare to suppress rebellion and inspire absolute loyalty. The unit's legendary status relied on cold, relentless administrative efficiency. As casualties or illnesses occurred, the army instantly substituted the fallen with trained reserves, keeping the ranks at exactly 10,000 men. This strict numerical consistency projected a terrifying illusion. To an enemy, the immortals appeared as an eternal, unkillable force. Across history, this patriarchal theater of war faced subversion from women who broke societal scripts to assert their own authority. The Dahomey Amazons of West Africa operated as an elite, formalized royal guard. They used fearlessness and psychological shock tactics to defend their kingdom, forcing French colonizers to reconsider their assumptions about gender in combat. Individual disruptors like Soviet sniper Lyudmila Pavlichenko dominated the modern theater of combat. With 309 confirmed kills, she utilized lethal precision to shatter enemy morale. For empires and marginalized individuals alike, the battlefield functioned as a performative space to assert a fierce cultural identity and undeniable autonomy. While armies communicated with enemies, ancient music functioned as ritual technology used to communicate with the divine. In Sumerian priestesses played bull-headed lyres adorned with gold and lapis lazuli. These instruments served as a sacred bridge between the human and divine, used to mourn the dead and appease the gods. West African cultures engineered the talking drum to mimic the tonal cadences of human speech. This created a literal wireless communication network that broadcasted royal commands and warnings across the land. In Mesoamerica, the Aztecs utilized clay whistles shaped like human skulls during human sacrifices. The instrument produced a blood-chilling shriek that simulated the cries of the dead. It weaponized sound to strike terror into enemies and open perceived portals. Ancient music functioned as a vital, functional mechanism designed to keep the cosmic engine turning and maintain worldly order. A medieval aristocrat's toxic makeup, the silent march of the immortals, the shriek of an Aztec flute, all accomplished the same goal. These were extreme, physical tools of communication used by people attempting to secure their place in a hierarchy by projecting an image larger than themselves. These hazardous, intense practices revealed the breathtaking lengths human beings will go to define their identity and prove they belong at the top. We tend to think of human history as a permanent, secure ledger, a catalog of dates and treaties perfectly preserved for us to study. But these records can disintegrate in a matter of seconds. Much of the human experience is actually gone. Political rivals burn libraries, parchment rots in the damp, and stone monuments eventually succumb to the shifting earth. If the ink fades and the official scrolls turn to dust, what actually remains? How does the memory of a civilization endure when the archives are lost? The answers usually survive outside the royal vaults. They persist in the mud, in the specific rhythms of daily labor, and in artifacts that proved too captivating to be successfully destroyed. This medieval manuscript shows 5 men gathered around a table. In the Middle Ages, the tavern was the town's primary news center, a place where knights, farmers, and traveling merchants shared information and ale in equal measure. The tavern keeper manned this ecosystem as a local authority. They acted as a chef, an accountant, and a judge, managing debts, tracking local gossip, and maintaining order with a heavy wooden club when arguments over a bill spiraled into violence. It was a visceral environment, defined by the smell of perpetual pottage, unpredictable brawls, and bards who constantly rewrote local legends through song to suit the crowd of the night. For the common person, life was never recorded on parchment. Their history survived through these undocumented rhythms of human connection and shared survival. Some histories are recorded directly into the earth. These are the Longji Rice Terraces in China, where the mountainside looks less like a landscape and more like the spine of a sleeping dragon. The Zhuang and Yao people, seen here in traditional red and black dress, shaped these steep hillsides over 7 centuries. using only hand tools and knowledge passed from parent to child, they turned vertical slopes into sustainable farmland. This design relies on a precise hydraulic choreography. Rainwater and mountaintop springs are caught in channels and pulled downward by gravity, flowing sequentially from one tier to the next to feed the crop without any modern machinery. This history endures as a physical pact between humanity and nature. It has outlasted empires because it relies on generational persistence rather than static monuments. In ancient Egypt, Queen Nefertiti and her husband Akhenaten, seen in this colossal sandstone statue, upended centuries of tradition by discarding the old gods to worship a single sun deity. But after year 12 of their reign, Nefertiti suddenly disappears from the records. Subsequent pharaohs actively tried to scrub her existence from history, chiseling her name off monuments and smashing her likeness to erase her religious heresy. Despite a systematic campaign to delete her from time, she survived because of this single item, a painted limestone bust found sitting in the ruins of an abandoned artist's studio in 1912. The bust features refined, poised features, but one of its eyes remains entirely unfinished. It is a moment of creation caught in stasis. That missing eye, that incomplete state, gave Nefertiti a permanence that her rivals couldn't chisel away. Her legacy outlasted a targeted purge because the world found it impossible to look away from her unfinished face. Some anomalies challenge our understanding of what is actually buried in the sand. This aerial view of Giza shows the Great Sphinx, which has stood as a guardian of the plateau for over 4 millennia. But just a few miles away in the village of Abu Rawash, local legends tell of a second submerged stone shape. When the Nile recedes, a massive feline form emerges from the mud and silt. Mainstream Egyptologists place the construction of the Great Sphinx at approximately 2500 BCE, during the era of the first pharaohs. However, geological evidence suggests the weathering marks on the Sphinx were caused by sustained prehistoric rain, forces that haven't touched this plateau since 7000 BCE. Official institutions dismiss sonar scans of geometric foundations at Abu Rawash as natural limestone formations, and they have yet to authorize an official excavation of the area. For now, the site remains a question mark under the mud. It stands as a reminder that the desert holds features that don't fit standard maps, and that the story of Giza might still have unread pages buried in the silt. The chaotic tavern, the hand-carved terraces, the hidden bust, and the drowned stone are all fragments of a massive unofficial archive. Human memory exists as a scattered living puzzle, found along muddy shorelines, within social rituals, and in the physical scars left on the earth. Understanding the past requires us to look beyond textbooks, to respect generational labor, and question the neat narratives handed down by institutions. The past is never truly gone. It is etched into the landscape and buried in our myths, surviving as long as we stay curious enough to keep searching for it.